Welcome to this chapter overview, looking at chapters 6 and 7 in the online textbook, 23 and 24 in the hard copy text. This is looking at macroeconomics, the bigger picture, as well as looking at how do we track the macroeconomy? How do we look at the macroeconomy in its aggregate? And we'll talk about that in just a second. Glad you're with me. Hope you find this helpful. Remember, email me if you have questions. And let's take a look at what we're going to learn in this chapter. We're going to look at what macroeconomics is versus microeconomics. We're going to look at the business cycle. We're also going to look at this idea of aggregate measures in terms of how do we measure whether the economy is healthy. How do we gauge that? And we're going to use that using aggregate measures, looking at the overall economy in terms of GDP, this idea of gross domestic product. We'll also take a look at CPI, the Consumer Price Index. We'll also look at unemployment, and we're going to delve deeper later into unemployment and inflation, but this chapter will give you kind of an overview of some of those things. There are some explainers in this chapter. I put together some explainers on calculating GDP, as well as how to calculate real versus nominal GDP, some explainers there as well, and CPI. And again, this will probably help more in latter units than here in the bigger picture, because we're going to focus more on GDP here than anything in that economic performance. So let's start at the beginning and look at this idea of macro versus micro. Well, first of all, the idea here is that in micro, we looked at at consumer business decisions. What are decisions that consumers are making? What are decisions that businesses are making? And those decisions made on the margin, those individual decisions that impacted their bottom line. Do we hire one more worker? Do we open one more plant? Do I eat one more slice of pizza? All of those things taken in aggregate, taken when you multiply the entire population, add up to an economy, a macroeconomy. And that's what we see today is macroeconomics is made up of all of those individual decisions that are being made by consumers, by households, by businesses, by firms, companies, countries. All of these things add up to the macroeconomy and what we see in the macroeconomy today, the bigger picture, if you will, looking at the globe versus just those individual decisions under a microscope. So when we look at things like, do we go to business school or do we take a job? That's a very microeconomic type of question versus how many people are actually employed in the economy. That's a macro question. So when we look at what's the salary that's offered by a company in order to take a job versus what are salary levels across the board. That's more the aggregate. We see that more in macro. And you get the idea in terms of the macroeconomy versus the microeconomy here. Now, it's important to note, again, that decisions made by individuals and firms essentially are the microeconomics that we've studied up to this point. And then macro, as I said, is aggregate. It's in the bigger picture, the overall level of unemployment, the overall level of gross domestic product, of inflation, all of those things. Looking at that in the bigger picture, think 30,000 foot level. We're up in a plane looking down at what's going on, not looking at it under a microscope. Big difference there in terms of what's happening. So it's important to note that those microeconomic decisions actually do impact macroeconomics because as you may guess, all of those individual decisions, if people are shifting how they are spending their money, or whether they are spending their money and how they are spending it, that can have a significant impact on the macroeconomy, on what is going on in aggregate, what's going on in the bigger picture. So it leads to this concept that the macroeconomy, the idea here is that the behavior of it is greater than the sum of those individuals and businesses and their actions and that sort of thing, which tends to lead to this concept of, I like to refer to it as a self-fulfilling prophecy, but this economists call it the paradox of thrift. And this is the idea that what happens when we fall on hard times? Well, businesses and families tend to cut back. They cut back on their spending, they cut back on their workers, they cut back on their investments, and this kind of leads to a self-fulfilling prophecy, a domino effect of making things worse, not better. Because when you contract in your spending, you contract in your hiring, time, you contract in your investments, that leads to a worsening of the economy. It doesn't help you. It may help you individually weather the storm, but it actually contributes to a lengthening of the storm, and actually keeps people there longer as a result of what we see there. So we like to think of the invisible hand, the importance of the self-regulating economy. But sometimes what we know from Keynesian economics, if you remember John Maynard Keynes, really came to fame during the Depression. The idea of government needs to step in and spend money to get us out of this depression, to hire people, put people back to work, get their confidence up so that they'll go out and spend money, and that will have a ripple effect, and hopefully encourage people to contribute into the economy, which will help the economy grow. Monetary policy is what we look at in terms of the Fed spending money and regulating the money supply through interest rates and other aspects that we'll take a look at in a later unit, as well as fiscal policy, government spending, taxing and spending, what levels of taxes and spending subsidies take shape. That's more in the fiscal policy handled by Congress and the president. You may remember that from government class. In those terms. But that really is part of that invisible hand, part of what we see going on behind the scenes, and it's more than just an invisible hand. It's actually a lot of other hands at work to help make it happen in the form of government action and government involvement, or government walking away in terms of government taking a step back in terms of imposing taxes to try and cut back on taxes to encourage economic growth in those areas. So that leads us to the idea of the business cycle. And this is where we see we can see contractions and expansions. We can see growth, and we can see a lack of growth, or what we call recession, and those periods. And there's really four of them. So the business cycle essentially is tracking these ups and downs. Think of it like a roller coaster. Whatever goes up must come down. We've heard that a lot. We don't want to stay down too long. That becomes a depression. The idea of a prolonged downturn. Recessions are periods of economic contraction. That's when businesses start to cut back on their hiring, or maybe they lay off workers, maybe they close some stores, some businesses will go under. We see economic times not so good, and employment tends to fall. Unemployment tends to rise during that period. Then we get to expansion, which is the idea of kind of that upward growth, the upturn, if you will, in the economy. And that's where we want to be. That's where we want to stay in terms of that growth. And after the Great Recession of 2008, 2009, we definitely saw a cycle prior to the pandemic that was one of the longest expansionary periods we've had in a very long time. For 12 years of 10 and a half, 11 years of economic growth that was significant. And that really is the idea of expansion during that period, or prosperity, if you will. And that leads us to the peak, which is kind of, you don't know you're there until you've already peaked, and you start to experience contraction or recession once again. And then the process starts all over. So you go through that recessionary period or contraction. You stay there too long in a trough, it becomes a depression. Then you hopefully find a way to turn the ship around and come back to expansion, and prosperity begins again. And that's really what we see in the business cycle. Now, we've seen this time and again over all kinds of business cycle peaks and troughs through the years. You can see this here, taken from the Krugman text in terms of the different expansionary periods and recessionary periods that we've seen over time. Now, how do we measure this? Well, we use, just like you would measure the health of a child or a person in your family. You would take their temperature. You would see, are they keeping food down? Are they having problems? Maybe stomach issues? Are they throwing up? Do they have a fever? Other types of symptoms that you would look for in measuring the health. And we do that with the economy as well. We look at things like the unemployment rate. This is brought to us by Fred. The St. Louis Fed handles a lot of the federal research and economic data from the Federal Reserve, and the Federal Reserve of St. Louis actually handles a lot of this Fred content. But basically, all of the data from the Federal Reserve that is public is in this Fred tool. So you can actually Google Fred unemployment rate, and it'll pop right up. Fred is a really great tool to use in macroeconomics. We're going to use it a lot. And we can see here over time, look at that pandemic, that unemployment rate just shot right up there, almost to 15%. Haven't seen that since probably the Depression at that point. And so you see some periods, there was one in the early 80s, there was one in the 70s there, one in the 50s where it got above 8%. But for the most part, we haven't seen that level of unemployment. And for it to reach almost 15% is saying something in those terms. So that definitely is one way that we can look at the health of the economy by looking at unemployment. We can also look at it in terms of growth. What kind of growth do we have over time? How can we measure the standard of living, what people are making when in their take-home pay, in terms of concerns about long-run economic growth? What is their standard of living in terms of things they have in their home? Notice electricity and the telephone and an oven or a stove and an automobile were almost non-existent in 1905. Fast forward to 1955, these are commonplace. Fast forward to 2005, you've got even more things to add to the standard of living. And you can see the long-run economic growth, the technological progress there, pushing out the PPF, is really significant here. It really shows us that economic growth that is taking place over time. We can also measure that with what we call real GDP per capita dollars. This is looking at real GDP and the idea of what is the real growth over time, and divide that by the population to see what is the standard of living in terms of that long-run growth. And we'll talk more about that a little later. We can also look at this in terms of inflation. What are the cost of goods that are bought and sold, and what is happening to the prices of those goods? Things that you would normally put in your grocery basket when you went to Giant, things like eggs and milk and bread and meat and fruits and vegetables. And they measure those over time, looking at each month, looking at how much they're worth and whether or not they are rising, the cost of those goods are rising or falling. That leads us to inflation if the aggregate price level of those items is rising, and deflation if they're falling. And then the idea of the inflation rate is calculated accordingly. And again, we'll get into more of those details later on in the semester. But the idea here is it's another way we can measure the health of the economy, looking at price stability, looking at whether the prices of these goods is changing rapidly or whether it's pretty constant in terms of what we see there. And so we can also look at this in terms of our relationship with our economy and our growth in comparison to other countries like Germany and China, Saudi Arabia that you see here. Not just in terms of a GDP, but also in terms of exports and imports, what we talked about in the last chapter with international trade. Where are their balances? Where are their positive contributions to the economy in terms of we're importing, but we're exporting more than we're importing, and in those places. Now we're seeing here, and we'll get into more of this later, but the idea is it looks like we're importing more than we're exporting because of the goods, the actual goods in the goods and services piece that is coming into the United States versus what's going out. Now, what you don't see there are some things like the services aspect that aren't necessarily coming through ports. They're not coming through ships. They're going electronically through the internet and being bought and sold in that fashion. So we see also free trade agreements having an impact on encouraging that growth in this open economy, in terms of encouraging countries to participate in free trade agreements. And as a result of either having a trade deficit or a trade surplus, depending on how much they're importing and exporting. But again, it's another way to measure the health of the economy by looking at what we're exporting and how does that compare to what we exported last year. What are we importing, and what other services are we selling in what we call the current and financial accounts, which is what we'll take a look at a little later. So all of this adds up to what the macroeconomy looks like in aggregate in terms of this this study of the entire economy, the health of the economy, looking at the business cycle, looking at government intervention through Keynesian economics, the idea of monetary policy. The Fed steps in to regulate the access and supply of money and interest rates as well, and fiscal policy, the idea of budgets. We look at the business cycle in terms of measuring if people are hiring. Is it an expansionary period or is it a recessionary period? And that hiring is falling, people are losing their jobs, unemployment is rising. These are problems that the government may need to step in and use some Keynesian economics to help resolve. And then what does it look like in the long run? What do we see over a longer period of time in terms of these aspects of inflation, deflation, unemployment, GDP, the trade imbalance, either exports or imports, in terms of free trade with other open economies? And what impact is that having on our price stability? What impact is that having on our overall GDP, our growth in production? All of these are contributing to taking a look at what the health of the economy really is. And we're going to track that macroeconomy in this chapter by looking at the idea of economic performance and the importance of, particularly, of the circular flow in GDP, which is what we're going to take a look at in Chapter 7. So we start off by looking at this idea of the circular flow. We talked about this in Unit 1, the idea that the economy begins and ends with us. We are human resources, but we are also households. We actually are consumers, and we buy things with the money that we earn as factors of production, as resources, human resources. We work jobs, we get wages. From those wages, we pay our taxes to the government, and then we use the remaining disposable income to buy goods and services, to buy our family goods and services, food, for instance, things that are imported into the United States, and we help to create things that are exported to other countries around the world. And so all of this is contributing to an expanded circular flow in terms of what we see in the macroeconomy. We were looking at it before in simplistic terms. Now what we see is it's a much more complex economy that deals with a lot of international trade, as well as the financial markets, the factor markets, these financial services in addition, and government has a role in terms of what's playing out here. So all of this, all that we see here in terms of households and firms, governments, and including other governments around the world, contributes to what we call the national accounts. This is all of our income, all of our products, everything in terms of tracking the flow of money goes through that circular flow, and that is what we call our national accounts, okay? That set of numbers. We look at that to determine how is the economy doing. We, again, look at it to measure the health of the economy. We look at this through wages. We look at this through what are the price of treasuries, of bonds that are out there, what kind of dividends are being earned by families based on stocks or additional increases in value or rent, quota rent, if you recall, on land and other properties and resources. All of this contributes to the idea of a circular flow of the economy. Now, the idea here, some key terms to establish with national accounts. We see stock. This is owning shares in a company. You buy stock. We're doing that through the How the Market Works game, right? And you can see how you're doing. The Dow had another record day today, and that is as a result of people buying shares in stock. We have bonds. People are buying bonds. They're IOUs. They could be municipal bonds or state bonds to provide for schools or bridges or other types of funding that the government has. They sell bonds in order to do that. It's an IOU. They'll pay you interest in addition to the money that you buy the bond for. It is a safer investment investment, but it is also a smaller rate of return in terms of what we see there. Now, we also see government transfer payments. These are things like food stamps and unemployment checks, things that are helping out the less fortunate that are down on their luck. Disposable income is the idea. Once I pay my taxes, and once I've paid my bills, what money do I have left over? Where can I spend it? And what can I do with it? That's the idea of disposable income. And then a lot of times we don't spend it, we save it. And so looking at private savings in terms of what kind of savings do people have to fall back on when times get tough. And what we see more and more is that credit is rising, private savings is falling. Is that of concern? Well, we've been concerned about it for the last 12 years. It hasn't seemed to make much of a dent in terms of overall spending and including government spending, as well as any confidence in the overall economy. And we're looking at a national debt now of $27 trillion. So it doesn't seem to have much of an impact thus far, but to be continued, who knows. The financial markets, as I mentioned, these are things like banking markets as well as stock markets. There's bond markets as well in those IOUs I talked about before. This includes foreign lenders in addition to domestic ones, investment firms, governments that are borrowing money and money changing hands. There's a lot going on out there, and this ties into that circular flow. So when governments buy money, when they purchase, they borrow money and they purchase things for the sake of coronavirus, for instance. We're looking at a stimulus bill that is $1.9 trillion from the Biden administration, and this is government borrowing in order to make some purchases to give to state and local governments and to states for healthcare purposes to really get vaccinations out there and really get this thing moving. We haven't seen a lot of that. We've heard a lot about it, but haven't seen a lot of it happening. And the vaccine distribution has really slowed to a trickle, unfortunately, especially in Maryland. And so we're not seeing a lot of that right now, and it's causing a lot of angst, and that is of concern. But that's definitely through government borrowing that we're looking at that. It's not like money just appeared out of nowhere. They're going to have to borrow the money from somewhere. Inventories, how much are people producing, and are they keeping it on the shelf, or is it actually flying off the shelf and being purchased? That's an important aspect here. What businesses are investing in their resources, investing in their capital expenses, CapEx, things like machinery and new buildings, new ways of doing business, innovating, all of that a part of investment spending. And then what final goods and services are being produced. This is really where GDP, or gross domestic product, is calculated. We look at the final goods and services produced by a country within a given year. And these are the final products, nothing used, nothing intermediate, but the final goods and services, that is calculated towards GDP. And it's only within a country's borders, from sea to shining sea would be included there. Not the intermediate goods, which would be something that maybe a company is making and then selling to another company to use. For instance, there are a lot of automakers that manufacture parts that are used in cars, but those are not counted towards GDP because they're intermediate goods. So what's being produced there is contributing to the final product of a car. You don't want to double count. So the intermediate goods would not count towards GDP. But it does tell us what is out there in terms of being produced, final goods and services along the way that can have an impact on the economy later on. So those are kind of the key terms we look at here for national accounts. Now, I want to take a look at GDP because we want to do a deeper dive here on the gross domestic product, delve into it more deeply here. And the reason is because this is a really important way to measure the health of the economy. We look at the total value of all final goods and services produced within the country in a given year. So think from January 1st to December 31st, within the country's borders, I will say from sea to shining sea, what are the final goods and services that are being produced. Now, if somebody's taking old trailers and refurbishing them into new products, that doesn't count because those were already new items. The refurbishment is a used good. That doesn't count towards GDP. Now, if they're using those resources that are being junked and they're turning them into new products that are then being sold, and it's a totally new product, and they're just using the recycled parts or whatnot in creating that, then that final product, it does count as part of GDP. So aggregate spending, what we really see here in terms of measuring the health of the economy is this idea of how much are consumers spending, how much are businesses spending, how much is the government spending, and then what are we exporting outside of the country versus what we're bringing in. And that's going to give us what we call aggregate spending, and that's really helping us get a better feel for the type of health of the economy that we have here. But we look at GDP as this idea of the total dollar value of all final goods and services that are produced within a country's borders in a given year. Now, we calculate this in three ways. We look up in the value-added model, we basically add up the value that producers are adding to the product. You may have heard this as a value-added tax. We've heard that quite a bit. And that's one way to look at GDP. We can add up all of the spending, and this is probably the most common one. This is the CIGX minus imports model, or the CIGNX, which is net exports. And that's the most common equation we see to calculate GDP. This is basically just adding up the consumer spending, investment spending, and by that we mean what businesses are spending on investment, not like investments in stocks and bonds. Those don't count towards GDP. Okay. Now, if a stockbroker charges a fee for you to make a trade, that fee would count towards GDP, but that would be the only part of that transaction that counts towards GDP. Anything else in there would not count. When you're buying stocks, that would not count in this situation. Investment spending is what businesses are investing in CapEx, in capital expenditures, in capital resources. Maybe it's for building new buildings or new machinery, new technologies, that kind of thing, what we see there. And then obviously adding up the government spending, and then in a net exports. Take your exports minus your imports. That's going to give you what is being exported versus what's coming in, and that's going to give us a better feel for what GDP actually is. And then the third avenue of calculating GDP is adding up the income that is paid for factors of production. Very similar to the value-added model, but the idea here is you're looking at your factors of production. How much are you paying for natural resources, for the human resources, for the capital resources, and then the income paid to those factors of production gives us a number that is our GDP as well. So we can see that there in terms of calculating GDP in a number of ways. Now let's talk about what's in and what's out. So in GDP, you can calculate, again, final goods and services. This includes anything that is final in product. This also includes capital goods. So if if someone is building a building for you and they are charging you for that building and you are paying for that building, that is going into GDP. It is not GDP for your company. Your company's not making money off of it. You're investing that money. But those capital goods do contribute to GDP down the road. But that is a part of GDP. That is a final product that your company is buying, the machinery or the building or the site, and new construction is a great example of this. New homes, for instance, new housing developments, new homes, those would be counted here, and any inventories that you have. You don't have to necessarily sell the item in order for it to count towards GDP. Now, keep in mind, if a house goes on the market that was sold last year, does it count towards GDP? It does not. It's used at that point. So an old home that's for sale and is sold during this year would not count towards GDP because it's already been on the market at one point in time. And the idea there is that isn't necessarily targeting growth. the new housing is what's targeting growth, and that's what we would see there. Now, yeah, as I mentioned, intermediate goods are not included in GDP. Anything that's going into producing a product. So, cutting down trees and selling them to the manufacturer, that's an intermediate good that would not count towards GDP. Any used goods, as I mentioned, used cars are a good example here. Used cars are never counted towards GDP because they're used. They've already been sold. They've already been counted as GDP at one point or another, and we don't double count. So you also don't count stocks and bonds, as I mentioned, and any items that are produced in other countries. So even if Apple is creating iPhones, but they're doing it in China, that counts towards China's GDP, unless it is made here in the United States, or they kind of get around this now because they say, it was the pieces were made in China, intermediate goods, but they were assembled and final product was made in the United States. Then it counts towards GDP. I know it's splitting hairs, but that really is what we see there. As I mentioned, the three ways you can add up. You can look at the final goods and services that are being produced. You can look at the factors of production that are being paid, or you can look at the sum of the value add in terms of what we see here. And we see all three of those in this particular graphic. So here we see what is the total spending on final goods and services that are produced here. It's $21,500 for the car. But you can see the factors of production that are made on the right-hand side here. The total payments to factors is adding up to the same amount, and then the value add is also adding up to that same amount of 21.5. So any of those three methods will still get you there to GDP, but they are the ways that we would calculate that. Again, going back to how do we calculate it, using the value add, using the income paid to factors, or using the CIGX minus or CIGNX model that we see there. So what is GDP looking like? Just pulled this a couple of weeks ago, and this shows GDP. This was the latest data they had at the time. This shows GDP, and you can see the peak there, and then the drop from GDP due to the pandemic. But you can see it's generally increasing. This goes back to the 1970s, and you can see even though we've experienced recessions along the way, we've had dips. There's that 2008 recession we talked about. Here's the pandemic, but we can see it's generally upward sloping, much like a supply curve. The idea there, because of PPF continuing to push out, you've got production possibilities, increasing opportunity costs, but the idea is you continue to do everything you can to use all your resources to make people better off without making people worse off. And that's continually what we see here as we continue to push every opportunity out there to make people better off as part of GDP. And that goes back to our circular flow in terms of the idea here of this circular flow and what we see with our role as consumers, our role as households, but also as factors of production, as human resources in this chain. And the idea there is that the economy begins and ends with you. So now let's turn to this idea of real versus nominal GDP, and this is where I tend to lose some students. So pause the video if you need to, go back, take a closer look. We've got explainers on real and nominal GDP at the beginning of these slides as well as at the end of these slides, so definitely check them out. Real GDP is the idea here that you're using a base year, and you are calculating the final goods and services that are actually produced, again, GDP, so it's final goods and services produced in a country within a given year, but you're using the prices of a selected base year. So essentially what you're doing is you're taking inflation out of the mix. So the number you have truly is the real GDP because inflation isn't in there. Nominal includes inflation, okay? Nominal GDP is that same thing, final goods and services produced in a country within a given year, but it's calculated using the prices in the year that they're produced. which means you're not using a base year. There's no adjustment for looking at it over a period of time. You're just looking at it based on the here and now. So nominal GDP, you think about it, is how much do we produce based on what the prices are right now for the current year. Look at 2020, for instance. Nominal GDP would look at it in terms of inflation, and you're not taking it out, so that would include inflation. Real GDP would say, let's go back and look at what the prices were in the base year of 2010. Then let's look at GDP in 2020, and using the prices of that base year of 2010, we can take inflation out of that picture and thus get a real GDP, essentially without inflation, and really see what kind of growth are we really talking about here. Because sometimes when you look year to year, the idea is nominal GDP shows you that your GDP is growing, but it's all inflation. And if it's just inflation, the fact that prices are rising, then your economy is not really growing. It's inflation that's growing. Prices are getting more expensive, but you're not necessarily producing any more than you were before. And that's the important piece, because that tells you, the red flags come out, the red lights kind of go off and say, alert, alert, this is a problem. So we get real GDP, as you can see down there, in some of the graphics I included here, by taking nominal GDP and dividing by the deflator. And we'll talk about the deflator here in just a second in the upcoming slide. But the idea here is that's going to give us real GDP because the deflator is basically telling us, hey, it's 120%, and that means we have 20% inflation. So if we take that 20% inflation out of nominal GDP, we can get a real GDP number that has no inflation in it. And that's ultimately what real GDP is designed to do, is to show us how is our economy really doing? How is GDP really in terms of the growth of our country? And that's really the difference between real and nominal GDP. Now, notice I said in the idea of real GDP was looking at it with a base year price. Nominal GDP is looking at it at current prices, right? So essentially, when we look at this base year for real GDP, we're looking at what we call chained dollars, okay? And this is the method of calculating changes by using averages between the growth rate using that base year I talked about, 2010, and then growth and the growth rate, calculating it using a later base year, such as 2020, for instance. And you're kind of measuring the average between the two of them to get what we call chain dollars. And we don't see a lot of that in AP Econ, but the idea there, just so you understand it, because you're going to see a lot of graphs in which that pops up quite a bit, is the idea that they're taking an average because sometimes it's a little harder to look at what the inflation rate is there, so they're kind of taking an average based on that, and that base year versus the later year to see what is our deflator based on that, what is our inflationary number, our inflationary number as a result of that, and then we would divide the nominal GDP by that deflator to get what real GDP actually is. Now, GDP per capita is just the idea. You take GDP, divide it by the total population, and that's going to give you essentially your real GDP per capita in terms of what you see there. So if we look at a couple of examples to show you the difference between real and nominal GDP, I think this is a good example, looking at the market for apples and oranges, oddly enough, right? We was talking real GDP and nominal is like talking apples and oranges. Here you go. So we have year one and year two. You can see here that the price of apples in year one is 25 cents. The price of apples in year two, 30 cents. The price of oranges in year one is 50 cents, and in year two is 70 cents. So if we look at this then, in terms of year one being our base year, what we see here is that we're buying 2,000 apples at 25 cents. So that's going to give us a total of $500 in terms of the amount of money that we're spending on apples, contributing to GDP. 1,000 oranges at 50 cents an orange, again another $500. So we have $1,000, and of course this is in billions. So you got $1 trillion essentially in apples and oranges in terms of contributing to GDP. And so our real GDP here is going to be the same as our GDP because it's our base year. So it's going to be the same number. GDP and real GDP are always going to be the same here. But notice here that the numbers aren't the same. And that's because in year two, we're going to use the year one numbers as our base. What we see here is what we calculate for nominal GDP is we calculate it using the year we're in, and we're not going to take that inflation out just yet. So this is going to give us the nominal GDP of $1,150 in terms of, $1,500 in terms of what we would see here. But what we didn't add up is looking at this from a nominal GDP point of view, or the real GDP point of view. And what we need in order to do that is to multiply the price of the base year times the quantity that's being produced. And that's going to give us that $1,150 that we see here. So instead of multiplying it by the 30 cents, we're going to multiply it by that base year of 25 cents and 50 cents respectively. So 2,200 apples being produced in year 2, not times 30 cents, but times 25 cents is going to give us $550. Here, the oranges is going to give us $600, and that gives us a real GDP of $1,150. Now, what you notice here is the nominal GDP essentially is $1,500. But the real GDP is $1,150. So what that tells us is that there is inflation in this environment, and a real GDP is actually a better read for the growth of the economy. It's not growing as large as we would like it to think. By looking at $1,000 and then $1,500, we would say, wow, we grew by 50%. Wow, that economy is really growing. But what we don't see here is the idea that with real GDP, we can now calculate and see, wow, it wasn't as much as we thought. It was $150 billion over our original base year. Not quite the growth we really thought it was. It wasn't the 50%. It was more like 15 in terms of the growth that we see there. So that's the difference between real and nominal GDP. And we can look at this time and again and see. Notice your nominal GDP. In terms of numbers here, you can see the base year here is 2005. They used a middle year instead of the earliest. But what we see is that real GDP in those 2005 dollars would take them to 9,086. So we can see that that their economy was growing and definitely has grown. But the idea here is that when you get to real GDP in 2010, you can see the economy has not actually grown. It's not actually, it's grown very little in comparison to what they thought was growth. They was thought in the terms of $2 trillion ended up to be $500 billion instead. So a very different mix. And that is why we look at real GDP, because by taking the inflation out of nominal GDP, we get a better read for how is the economy really doing according to GDP. And real GDP is definitely giving us a better read on that. And so you can see here, look at that nominal versus real GDP, the rate of change in terms of what we see from year to year. In nominal, it looks like the economy is doing really well, when in fact, you can see that it's kind of falling off there and was from year to year in terms of real GDP. And that rate of change is kind of falling over time in terms of what we saw there. And then kind of leveling out, as we saw here in the 70s, 80s, into the 90s in terms of that. So it gives us a better read of what the economy is doing in terms of our gross domestic product. Now I want to take a look at consumer price index. The idea here is that we will come back to this and look at inflation, unemployment, and the CPI in a later unit. But this is just to kind of give you an overview read of what's going on here. So if we look at price indexes, again, we're looking at the aggregate price level, working at what the price level is overall in measuring the economy. And we do this by looking at a market basket. Think of it like a basket you get when you go into Giant. You put the same items in, and each month you go back to the supermarket, you pick up the same basket and you put the same goods into the basket each month. You go to the counter, you check out, you get the receipt, and you see how much did we spend this month. And then next month you go back again and you do the same thing all over again. And month to month, the government does this with this basket of goods, And month to month, they look at what is the change in prices based on the same goods going into the market basket. This is what we call the Consumer Price Index. And this gives us a feel for if the prices are going up rapidly, then we know inflation is higher. And that needs to be of concern because it means that people's dollars in their pockets is going to be worth less because they're spending more of those dollars to pay for the same amount of goods. If we see that there's very little change, then we can see that there's very little inflation. And if we see that there is a drop in price, we can see there's deflation, which means that your money in your pocket is actually going to be worth less in terms of the in terms of the approach. It's going to not cost you as much, but you may lose your job. It's not going to cost you as much to buy things at the supermarket, but you may not have a job or the same level of salary in order to do so. You might have to take a pay cut if you keep your job or something like that. So the market basket is really helpful here, and that price index is basically we look at the cost of the market basket, and you can do this in a given month. Over the base month, last month is usually the marginal basket, and then multiply that by 100. That gives you a range. And usually, what we see is anything below 3% is usually pretty good in terms of that. Usually, obviously not negative, but usually anywhere from 1 to 3% usually is within range and within reason. Economists aren't too worried unless it gets above that 3.5% number. Then they start to pay more attention to that. So we can look at that GDP and real GDP also to measure this level of inflation, and this can have an impact on price indexes, which can also tell us what's the measure of inflation. Look here at the pre-frost versus post-frost GDP in terms of what's calculated here, and the cost of the market basket. Obviously, a post-frost means that the goods that we're buying in that basket are going to be much more expensive, and clearly they are in that respect. And that shows us that there may be other factors at work too, not just inflation, but also the environmental factors that can have an impact on this situation as well. The inflation rate, then we would take, again, the change. So the price index in the latest month minus the previous month divided by the previous month. Again, the idea of the change here is new minus old divided by old times 100 is going to give you the inflation rate. And again, anything below 3% is usually pretty good. The inflation rate here gives us the idea of the consumer price index, and that is that annual percentage change. We also see this come out by month. The Fed data does this monthly as well. I have a chart here which I'll show you, which looks at that CPI trend and those measures. And what does this tell us? Well, it tells us that people are spending more and more of their income on these products if these are changing. And what we see here is the cost of goods isn't going down; the cost of goods is actually rising. And we continue to see that this is an indicator of higher inflation. And again, as long as it's kept in check, it's not going to be a problem. It's when it starts to get above that 3.5%, 4%, 8%, then economists start to pay attention, and usually elected officials start to pay attention too. That's more when the Fed gets involved and says, we're worried about inflation, it's rising too much. We really need to cut back on spending. We need to raise interest rates and cut back on the money, the flow of money out of the Fed into banks and into people's homes and incomes and their spending. And when they turn down that faucet, that really does keep the economy from overheating and that inflation from rising. A couple of other factors we can look at here in terms of price measures, and that is, I mentioned the consumer price index, but there's also something called a producer price index. You can look at what the market's going to be by looking at what producers are spending for goods. That's a good indicator. The PPI is a good indicator of where the economy is going because it hasn't hit consumers yet, but producers are already paying higher prices, which means they're going to pass those prices along along to consumers, and that will hit CPI down the road. It could be a month, 2 months, 6 months, but it is going to hit the consumers as well. So that's a good indicator. If you watch PPI, you can get a good indicator where CPI is going. I also mentioned GDP deflator. We talked about that one already in terms of it being a good barometric measure of the taking a reading on the economy as well, and looking at that. And we talked about how to calculate. You can go back to that piece in the video in terms of how to calculate that, but it's just nominal GDP over the deflator essentially gets us real GDP, and so we can look at that in terms of that rate. That gives us the deflator, which gives us real GDP, which shows us what type of inflation is actually at work. And we can see here that PPI can be somewhat tempered, but CPI really models and falls with that PPI as well. And you can see the GDP deflator is almost in lockstep with CPI because, again, it's measuring inflation, and so is CPI, and that's why they're both collectively or individually good reads on how the economy is doing. Just by looking at one or both of them, you can get a pretty good and pretty accurate read of what's happening there. Really good video. I encourage you to watch. This is Paul Solomon. He's really great, and he does a lot of economic videos on PBS. He has one here on how fast prices are rising in taking a look at that, and I would encourage you to check that out. It's in the slides, so definitely take a look. Here is a summary in terms of what we've talked about today, looking at the idea of national accounts, what's happening in the flow of money from households and firms and the government and foreign governments in terms of exports and imports, and the idea of the circular flow, the broader circular flow, looking at that national account of money. We measure this through GDP. We can also look at this through inflation, CPI, Consumer Price Index. We measure GDP by looking at gross domestic product, the idea of adding up consumer spending, investment spending, government spending, and then exports minus imports or net exports to get that GDP. And this just tells us, how is the economy doing? Is it doing well? Is it heating up? Is it overheated? Is it so expansionary it's out of control? Is it slowing down? Is it tepid? Are there concerns that we need to take a look at? All of that is helping us to take a better read. And we can even get an even better read if we look at real GDP versus nominal, because we can take inflation out of that picture, and we can look at what is the actual growth of products, of goods and services in the economy, more so than nominal, where inflation is included in that mix. And then we closed out looking at Consumer Price Index and how that tells us how the economy is doing based on the inflationary numbers that we saw there. So again, some key terms you'll want to check out in the chapter. If you want to pause the video here and kind of go through the list, anything you don't know would be helpful to go back and take a look at. I did mention the explainers that are here on calculating GDP. If you want to look at some experts taking a look at how to calculate GDP, how to calculate real GDP, as we talked about in the example, as well as how to calculate CPI, looking at the Consumer Price Index. And again, we have a whole unit where we will cover unemployment and inflation in that respect. I want to leave you with this, the national debt clock. I paused it, but $27 trillion, the number we're looking at, pretty significant. But that is all of the government spending in which we haven't we haven't had money to cover it. We have essentially borrowed from individuals and others in order to pay for all of that. So that is a significant impact of how the economy is doing, because we pay interest on that. And you will notice in terms of the money being spent, they say the debt per taxpayer is about $222,000 in terms of what we're spending there, and that is significant because we pay interest on that debt every year. And it is significant in the hundreds of billions of dollars that we are paying. And this is net debt right there. It is $393 billion. Well, that's a significant portion of the government's income, of the government's budget, is going, almost $500 billion is going just to pay for the interest on the debt. and with some economies that aren't as well off as the U.S. economy, that can be a significant strain, especially in hard times. So it's something to think about as we move forward here and as we look at the broader aggregate supply and aggregate demand, and we look at the economy as a whole. I included the take-home quiz study question answers. The explanations are on my MCPS classroom underneath the take-home quiz, but definitely there's some good questions in here that I think you'll find helpful. I also included in this chapter on the My MCPS classroom the sample questions, the Unit 2 sample questions, which are here. Again, some more good questions to get in front of you, some practice questions to use there in terms of calculating real and nominal GDP, calculating GDP, calculating CPI, and looking at the circular flow and households and their role within it. I hope you found it helpful on this overview, and we will good luck on the upcoming assessment, and we will look forward to seeing you in Unit 3.